I'm Rob Skinner, and this is the Rob Skinner Podcast. Today on episode 78, I interview Todd and Patty Asaad from Dallas, Texas. Todd and Patty lead a church of nearly 1,300 disciples. The Dallas church has been a bright spot of health and growth over the last 15 years. Here's what you'll learn. How they faced failure, getting fired, and then went on to lead a consistently growing, healthy church. How a loving ministry philosophy can help change and grow stuck and stagnant disciples and ministries. How to become a kingdom connector and build better friendships. And how Patty's been able to lead while coping with a chronic illness. All this and more on the Rob Skinner Podcast. Welcome back to the Rob Skinner Podcast. My goal is to inspire you to live a no-regrets life, make this life count, and multiply disciples, leaders, and churches. Today we're going out to Dallas, Texas to talk to Todd and Patty Asaad. Todd and Patty lead a church of over 1,000 disciples and have for the past 10 or so years. And I'm looking forward to talking to them today. They're good personal friends, and I'm happy to have them on the program today. Todd and Patty, welcome to the program.
Thanks, Rob.
Thank you. We're glad to be here.
Looking forward to spending some time with you and your listeners.
Me too. Todd and Patty, how'd you guys become Christians?
You know what, Patty, why don't you go first?
Okay. Well, it was back in 1980, and it was the beginning of my freshman year in college. I had just turned 18, and I was just feeling like there was something missing in my life. And I actually even said that to a friend. And then the next day, somebody met me and invited me to what we called back then soul talk. I thought it sounded really strange, but I thought maybe I can meet nice Christian boys there. So I said I'd go. And I remember I went and met some of the women from church, some of the sisters, and I really liked it. Well, this was on a Wednesday. And the person who met me, her name was Nancy, she invited me to go on a campus retreat with them that weekend, that Friday. And I don't know what made me go. I thought, sure, sounds fun. And I went. It was a couple of hours away. I mean, all kinds of goofy things went wrong. Like I remember we got on the bus to go, and then they realized they don't have a driver. And so we had to wait 2 hours for them to find a driver. But I went and I just loved it. And then Connie Mancini, Mark and Connie were leading the campus ministry there, asked me if I'd like to study the Bible. I went to church the next day. And this was even when we had church twice on Sundays. I went to Sunday evenings. I just loved it. And she asked me to study the Bible. And she came over on Monday. We talked for a while. We started really studying Tuesday. And it was just what I'd been looking for, what I needed. I wanted to get closer to God, and I got baptized Friday.
Oh my gosh. 1 week? A little over a week?
Yeah, 10 days from the day I was met.
With Connie Mancini?
Yeah, well, that Connie wasn't the one of the other campus girls met me, but Mark and Connie were leading the ministry. They were super young too.
I mean, what an incredible connection. Now they're on staff in your church. That's amazing.
Oh, yeah. It's really special getting to be with them again after all these years. I mean, because I still look at them as they're my spiritual parents.
Wow.
So it's good having them here.
It's like one of those stories. It's like God brings things around. And I know Patty always loved the Mancinis deeply. And for her and me, it was a treat having them move here about 10 years ago and serve on the staff.
Wow. How about you, Todd?
Yeah, my story is I wish I would say I had a tender heart like Patty did. But long story short, after graduating from high school, did a couple years in Danville, Illinois, moved up to Chicago to go to chiropractor school in the west suburbs of Chicago. And there a young man named David Legier reached out to me and asked me to come to church. And, we were studying, and I remember just looking at him thinking, church or Bible study. It's like guys our age don't go to Bible study. And I just wanted to blow him off. But it's interesting because during that time when I was in Chicago, I was writing a diary, and I remember thinking, man, just something's wrong. Something's wrong with my what I'm doing. And I came at I don't know, maybe about 3 or 4 months, I said, I know what it is. It's my relationship with God. And so I decided to go with Dave to church and met other disciples and started studying the Bible with Marty Fuqua, Terry Stanfield. And I would say I was pretty immature and kind of out in left field, but man, I loved the body. I loved the church. And I think the more as I studied the Bible, the more I started to get convicted that I wasn't following it. I was a hypocrite, and I saw that I was a hypocrite. And so I had a decision I had to make: is either A, I'm going to continue to be a hypocrite, or I'm going to change and not be a hypocrite. And I hated hypocrisy. And I realized I was the biggest hypocrite there was. And so, I became a disciple. And back in the early days of Chicago, I think when I first started going to church, I think the Chicago church was like 40 members or something.
Wow. So what year was that, Todd?
Golly, 82 maybe, 82, 83.
Isn't that when they planted the church? Didn't they plant it in 82?
Yeah, I was right. That was like one of the probably first people that got reached out to.
Oh my gosh. And how old were you at the time? You're in chiropractic school.
Yeah, I was like maybe 20. 21 when I became a disciple.
Wow. Okay. Powerful. So you're that's what's one thing that's really interesting about you, Todd. Maybe people don't know. You are a doctor of chiropractic.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yeah.
So you became a Christian. How many more years did you study it?
I finished my degree. I think they were hinting around for me to go in the ministry, and I was like, man, I'm so involved in the chiropractic school and financially. And I'm like, I need to finish my school before I, do anything else. And so I suffered for like 5 years, and it was great discipling because, it really made me push myself in areas that I needed to. And so I actually ended up getting my degree, but then went into the ministry before I could really practice.
Wow. What a sacrifice. How could you make that choice? I mean, for people that are working a job or they poured time into a particular career, what helped you to make that kind of a decision? Like, I'm going to do ministry.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think one of the reasons I went into chiropractor school is, my grandmother used to go to a chiropractor, and it really helped her out a lot physically. And I remember, having a desire, I wanted to help other people. And so that was one of the reasons I went into chiropractic. And then I was an intern for the church when I was going to school. And I remember thinking when I was asked if I wanted to go into ministry, I was like, well, I can help people physically for a few days, or I can help people eternity by being in the ministry. And that was when I made my decision to go into ministry. Now, it helped that I was dating Patty, and she was very attractive. And so it was fun, working with her in the ministry. So that was a benefit there.
I was in the ministry before I met Todd.
Okay, so let's talk about that. So, Patty, how and when did you know that Todd was the one for you?
That is such a fun question, because I really do look at it that other than my salvation, Todd is the greatest blessing in my life. I really
did he pay you to say that? I mean, what was there?
I have it written. He wrote it out right here for me to look at. But honestly, it's happy. And I look back, it's just a blessing from God. I was so immature. I didn't know what I was looking for. And I remember it was so fun. I knew I wanted someone spiritual and all these things, but I went on a date with Todd, and I didn't even want to go. And because one of my roommates kind of liked him, I thought, well, I'll just go and talk up her. I think I fell in love on that first date. I mean, I wasn't thinking, oh, this is a man I want to marry, but it was the most fun first date. I had ever had.
Wow.
And so I started really praying about, and this is what I'm talking about, my immaturity. I prayed some of the dumbest prayers, but God in his mercy answered them anyway. And I just felt like God wanted me with Todd. Like, it was really funny. One time we would always be on double dates and with large groups, and I felt like we never really got to talk. And on one of our dates, we were all caravanning somewhere, and Todd got lost and ended up going about 10 miles out of our way before we made our way back. But it meant we really got to have this great conversation. And so I felt like that was an answer from God. And I debated if I should even share this. This is so stupid. Here, Todd's working on his doctorate, but we were always just having so much fun and being so goofy together. I remember praying, but Lord, is Todd really smart? And of course, Todd is brilliant. And first, I don't know what made me pray that. Well, the next time we go out, Todd is telling me all about some sort of classic Greek philosopher he was reading at the time. And I don't remember who it was. And I thought, okay, that was another little box I checked off. And then I remember praying, because I was already in the ministry and Todd was still in school. And I remember thinking, okay, I really want someone who can lead me spiritually. And this is such a shallow thing, but it got my attention. That next, but right after I prayed that, Todd and two brothers, young guys that he had baptized, started a Bible talk. Their first week, they had 17 visitors. In just that month, Todd studied the Bible with 4 guys that got baptized that month.
Oh my God.
So I felt like this was this amazing answer to my prayer from God. But I look back at it now, at my age now, and think, oh, that was ridiculous. I can't believe I was praying such stupid prayers. But, it's funny how God meets us where we are.
Right. Wow. So Todd, you're about 6'4". Did that play any role, just how tall and handsome he was?
There you go.
Well, of course it did.
Aside from the spiritual factor and how smart he was.
Well, I wanted someone who was funny.
Yeah.
And Todd was just so much fun. That was huge for me.
Okay. So what year did you guys get married?
88.
88. Okay. So it took a while for you guys to get married. And then can you quickly just recap your ministry career? From being in Chicago together to now being in Dallas, Texas, where have you been? Where's God brought you?
Man. So, hey, can I say one thing real quick about
you got it.
When I met Patty?
Please.
So one of the things I would just say, one of my attitudes when I was a single guy is I really wanted to encourage the single sisters. So I made it in, kind of not a mission, but a philosophy, an attitude that, man, I'm going to take the sisters out and I want to show them, I want to encourage them, because it's tough. It's hard being a single woman in the church. And so I remember just trying to make dates fun. And I remember that first date I had with Patty, we had fun, and it was so encouraging. And, I was still pretty immature, but I remember just building that friendship with Patty. And I think that's when, I kind of knew she was the one, because Patty became my best friend. So kind of looking over our ministry career, after we started dating, we actually moved to St. Louis. We're there for about almost 2 years in the church there. That's where we got married. After St. Louis, we moved to Cincinnati. We were there for less than a year. Then we moved to Indianapolis, where both of our boys were born. And we want to give a big shout out to them. We love them, have a great relationship with both our boys. And then we moved back to Chicago for 2 years. And so we what I call the Midwest tour.
Yeah.
Then long story short, and that's part of our story, is that we got out of the ministry in Chicago and moved to Dallas. And that was, golly, almost 24 years ago.
In 96?
November of 96.
Wow. Okay, we'll talk more about that. So you've been in Dallas for 24 years.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow. And you're a Southern girl, right, Patty?
Yes.
You can
Yeah, I can't hide it. I felt like I'd come home when I moved here.
And I think you told me you're born in Louisiana, isn't that right?
Uh-huh. Yes.
Okay. Are you familiar with the Duck Dynasty characters?
Yes.
Those aren't your cousins, are they?
Yeah, could be.
Well, they could be.
Okay.
I have cousins who noodle. Do you know what that is?
With the catfish fishing?
Yes, where you put your hand in a dark hole and wait for the fish to bite it and pull it out.
Oh my, that
That's
is
wrong.
like my worst nightmare. Just the
That's wrong.
thought of that is like, oh gosh, I
Yeah.
can't
No
believe
desire to do that.
no way, no way. Well, let's talk a little about it. You've had a long career, been in, out of the ministry. You gave up a potentially incredibly profitable career to go into the ministry. What's one thing you wish you'd known when you began your career in the ministry way back in 88 or so?
Yeah, that's a hard question. I think the main thing is I wish I just relaxed more and had fun with it. I look back on, I think some of it's just being in your 20s, it's how things are, but you feel like, you're starting your life out, you have to do everything well. And I put so much pressure on myself. And yes, I had fun with my friends and all that, but I look back at it and I feel like I just had this anxiety and this, how do I want to put it? I had to prove myself mentality. And I wish I could have changed that sooner.
Yeah, I think for me, boy, it's hard. I mean, I agree with Patty. There's a bunch of different things I'd like to say, but maybe I wish I would have learned how to be more humble or vulnerable about how I felt about things. I think I could, I looked at my first 10 years, literally, Rob, my first 10 years as a disciple, and I affectionately call it the decade of ignorance.
Mm.
I think of my first decade as a disciple, and I'm like, where was I? It just didn't seem like things were clicking in some ways. And I think if I would have been more vulnerable to be, open about what I was feeling, thinking, engaging with people versus kind of like putting up a veneer, a facade, and just kind of going with the flow versus getting deeper, I think it would have helped me probably be a better husband, better father, better friend to people. And so I would say that's probably the big thing.
Why would you call it a decade of ignorance?
Boy, I just think I had conviction, but I look back and maybe in a sense of regret that I wish I would have done things differently the first 10 years as a disciple. And so I realize, and I go back to that vulnerability, that openness, and just trust God and not worry about what people thought, but more what God thought. But I think I needed to learn how to express that with people. And so I think it would have helped me. I think, again, it would have helped me be a better friend, leader, partner. So that's why.
Can you point out a particular instance where you could go back and do it differently? Any snippet from your life where you go, man, if I were to do it over again, if I could go back in time, here's how I would have handled that situation.
I think, boy, I can give you probably about a dozen different examples.
Well, just an easy one.
I think purity, just maybe not struggling with some of the purity things that a lot of men go through. And I think if I was more vulnerable and open, instead of trying to deal with it myself and being humble about pulling other brothers in, it might have protected me a little bit more. And so, I think I've learned that and over the last decades, but again, we became a disciples in the early 80s. So we've been doing this now for almost 40 years. And I just wish I grew in that area quicker.
Mm. Okay. Well, along with that, what do you consider to be your biggest failure or setback, and what did you guys learn from it?
Probably was when we were let go from the ministry in 96 in Chicago. And there were a lot of reasons that were given. There's just some bad dynamics going on. And someone had told some stories about us that weren't even true. And when we were let go, those were used as the basis for us being let go. And but the funny thing is I look back on it, and we needed to be fired so bad. I mean, not that we were growing our ministry, we were doing all sorts of things, but we just had to learn some character things. And now I'm just so grateful for it. For example, when Tom talked about vulnerability, I wasn't vulnerable either. I didn't know how. I remember sisters trying to talk to me about it, and it just did not click for me. I would think I was so vulnerable because anytime something violated my conscience, I would get that out. I would confess it, but I didn't know how to really get out what I was feeling. Therefore, if I felt insecurities or hurts, they would just stay in my heart and fester. And finally, after everything that had happened to us, being fired and moving to Texas, because we were out of the ministry our first 2 years here, I was just feeling so desperate to work through the hurts of what had happened that out of desperation, I feel like for the first time, I learned to be really vulnerable. Mm-hmm. And this would be no big deal for a normal person, but I remember calling up another sister and who was trying to help me at the time and just saying, I'm so depressed, I don't know what to do, because I felt like I had no role anymore. I was really, really sick. Todd was having to travel all the time with his job, and it would normally that wouldn't be a big deal, but for me that was huge. Mm-hmm. And she was wonderful to me. I felt like I had a safe place to be really open. It's really funny. I've asked her since. She didn't even remember it, but this was such a milestone for me. And through learning to be vulnerable, I would say on a scale of 1 to 10, my joy probably went to from a 4 up to a 9. Mm. And because I finally learned how to get things out and work through it, and the hurts no longer festered in my heart. In any D group I had, anything I shared about, that was about all I could talk about for about 2 years, because it was such an eye opener for me. Wow. So even though it was so hard, I'm just so grateful for it, because I feel like I learned all these lessons through that I really, really needed.
Wow.
Yeah, and I would say, again, it's very similar, because we've been married now for almost 40 years, but a lot of these are very similar because we did it together. And, one of the questions you asked about what I wish I knew when I started the ministry or began my career in the ministry, but it's the biggest failure, I think, along with what I shared about the humility aspect of it. I think I was a big people pleaser. I really did care more about what people thought versus what God thought. And I think I wasn't open. I wasn't vulnerable. I wasn't willing to fight for what I believe God was trying to teach us and train us, and went along and did things more out of fear for people than being concerned about what God thought. And I think that partially led to us being fired. And I think it was a good purging of people pleasing when we were out of the ministry. And that's a big part of our story, because when we got fired in the ministry, we moved to Dallas. We had a very strong conviction is that, well, we're disciples of Jesus. And I remember Nick Young asked us if we wanted to lead a family group, actually 2 family groups. And we're like, well, hey, we were disciples before we went into ministry, and we're going to be disciples now. And so we started leading a family group and overseeing another one. And literally for 2 years, I think Patty and I met like 8 people that personally we met that became disciples.
Wow.
I think like over 20 people were baptized in those 2 groups, and I think we had a few people walk away. But it was just so refreshing, loving people, being concerned about what God thinks versus what man thinks. And what I really appreciate is that I was able to say some things here in the early years of our time in Dallas that, because we were trying to be a part of the solution in the Dallas church, Nick and other people, they took the time to listen because they saw we were really trying hard, but we were willing to step up and maybe talk about things that we saw that we wanted to address, or maybe we even disagreed with. But again, we were trying to be a part of the solution, not just sit back and be critical. And so I would say some of our greatest failures set us up for the last 24 years here in the Dallas church.
Wow, that's powerful. I was reading oh, go ahead, Patty.
Oh, I was just going to say, if we had learned to be vulnerable sooner, I don't think things would have headed south in Chicago quite the way they did. Because I think people would have asked us, so what's really going on? They would have known our hearts, but because we weren't vulnerable, people just really didn't know us. So when someone was saying some kind of odd things about us, all that, they were very quick to believe it. But I put that on myself because people didn't know us, our hearts.
Yeah. And, we worked through it, got great relationships, and I tease AT Arneson all the time that, you guys fired me. But it wasn't him.
He wasn't leading the church.
He wasn't leading the church. So I mess with him all the time.
I was reading an article about ministry careers, and it was sobering because one of the statistics that I read was over 90% of people that start out in the ministry do not finish in the ministry. Ministry has one of the highest attrition rates of any career out there. And you guys have been in the ministry now almost 40 years. What do you attribute that? Just hanging on? Of course, you were out there for a little while, out for a couple of years. What's helped you?
Well, and let me jump in. I'll say this, and I'd like to hear what Patty wants to say. So being out of the ministry for 2 years was actually really, really good for us, especially for me. Because one, I think what happened is that finishing chiropractor school, then being in the ministry for literally a decade in the Midwest, moved to Dallas because I couldn't find a job in Chicago, found a job here in Dallas literally in 3 days. And so we're like, well, God wants us here in Dallas. And so I had this job.
Were you doing chiropractic then?
Oh, no, it'd be almost impossible to go back into that because I'd have to get licensed and go back to school. And I had to go into a job that I could support my wife and 2 kids and make enough money. Now, we were pretty poor that first year, but it was a sales job. And bro, I did well. I mean, after the first year, we bought a house, bought a truck. I was actually doing a really good job.
Texas.
This is country music. Sounds like a country music song starting right there.
Exactly. Yeah. And so, but what it was really good for my self-esteem, because I think I had really poor self-esteem of who I was or what I was capable of. I didn't have good theology in the sense of how I was valued by God and other people. And so I think with working in those 2 years and God blessing it, my self-esteem was raised up. And I think it really helped me be secure and what I believed and my convictions. And again, talking to other people here in the church and it really helped develop how we treat people, how we lead people. Our discipling took another step in the sense of, hey, God's way does work. Linda Brumley used to say that all the time. God's way always works. And we believe this. So, hey, we're going to do it God's way. But because my maybe security grew, my confidence grew, my ability to love people grew, we were able to really engage the ministries that we led over the last 22 years here and just really love people. And I think being able to do it now for 20 plus years here in Dallas and then the 10 years in the Midwest is, I think, one of the reasons why we've had such longevity is because we were able to take seriously the lessons God was teaching us over the last 3+ decades and really love people, love them, but lead in such a way that it's a lifestyle. It's not I don't know what the word I'm looking for, like a flash or work real hard and then rest, work real hard and rest. It's like, no, there's a consistency of, this is a lifestyle.
Mm.
And so, but I think part of it was I had to grow in my confidence, my understanding of God, and really learn how to love people.
Um, Longevity in the ministry, that's a good question. I feel like it's been different things at different times. And for me, I've been in and out more than Todd, and I'll get to that in a second. But it's been a different issue each time I've had to root out on my character. Like the first time I was working as a reporter somewhere and I loved it. This was before I ever met Todd. But there was just something in me that didn't want that distraction. I felt like God wanted me to go in the ministry. I prayed about it and prayed about it, and finally quit my job and moved somewhere to train for the ministry. And it was all of a sudden this peace came over me because I felt like I was doing what I was supposed to be doing.
Mm.
And then after we got fired, that had been such a hard time. I had a real fear of going back in the ministry. And I realized I'd drawn lines in my heart of places I didn't want to go for God. And I knew I had to work through that.
Mm.
And so I did. And then it was really funny the next time there were financial problems in Dallas in 2003, and the women were taken off staff. And so again, I went back to writing. And at first, it was really, really hard the first year. Then the second year, it was really, really fun. I mean, the work was I was freelancing, the work was coming in, magazine, newspaper. I liked the types of stories I was doing. I was getting to do a humor column. I mean, for me, that was just the ultimate. And then I'm asked to go back in the full-time ministry. And at first, I knew it was the right thing to do, but it was hard.
Mm.
I didn't want to. And God made it a little easier. Some of the editors I'd been working with quit their jobs and moved on. So I was going to have to form all new relationships in the business and stuff. So that made it a little bit easier. But I did it in the beginning out of a sense of duty. But I prayed for God to give me the love back for it. And he really did.
Wow.
I mean, there is nothing else I want to do, but I just wanted to make sure, I wanted to be pleasing to God. Do I think you can be pleasing to God outside the ministry? Absolutely. But I felt like for me, that's what God was leading me to do.
Right.
And even when my heart wasn't in it, when I'd pray about it, God just gave that passion and love for it back. Now it's like you practically have to hold a gun to my head to get me to write anything. And when originally, years ago, that's what I didn't want to give up.
Right. Well, there's an additional issue in that, Patty, you've had a long-standing chronic illness, and if you can share with us how that's affected your career and how you've managed to have such a long career in the face of that. Can you share with us about that?
In the beginning, actually, I was first diagnosed before I met Todd, and it was really scary because I was 21 and I'm thinking I'm never going to feel good again. Will I have a normal life? Will I be able to get married, have children, all this sort of stuff? And I was actually an intern at that time. And one thing that's great about ministry is you work a lot of hours, but you have flexibility.
Mm-hmm.
That really helped. But it also helped me work through some issues in my relationship with God. Because right after I knew I was probably going to be diagnosed with it, and I was so afraid. And I was in
excuse me. What was the diagnosis? What
lupus.
Lupus. Okay. And can you describe for our listeners what that is and what are the symptoms?
In the beginning, now it's an arthritic condition. It's very closely related also to MS, autoimmune disease. And for me, it started out with fevers every afternoon and just extreme fatigue, just not kind of feeling like I had the flu every afternoon.
Okay.
And more symptoms have developed over the years, a lot more joint and muscle pain and all that. And the weakness has gotten worse, but that was how it started. I realized I was running a fever every day.
Wow.
And that was when they started doing the battery of blood work to figure that out. Why? But it really helped me. I felt like when I was so sick, I mean, for a while, I think I was probably depressed. I got a little hopeless. And I knew I had to work through it. In my head, I knew God did not stop loving us, but in my heart, I felt like He had.
Wow.
And I had to work through some things in my relationship with God to really see His love. And I had to do that by myself because I'd gone to live with my parents, and they had this house in the Ozarks at that time. I was far away from all my friends. Back then, we just had a telephone with the long cord in the kitchen, you
Oh
know.
yeah. Yep.
And if I'm working through all my feelings, the whole family's hearing me, and I had to work through it with God.
Hmm.
And he helped me. It really, I felt like during that time, it was a real milestone for me. I started to understand how much God really does love us, just through things I read in the Old Testament that misinterpreted in the past, all sorts of things. And the thing I think that's helped over the years too is I've realized I have to learn different ways of doing things and figure out what works for me. For example, I have to be very, very specific in the way I talk. I mean, the way I train. And because I can't be like, if I'm training a campus woman to lead a campus ministry, I couldn't walk on campus with her. Part of lupus is you can't get sunlight. I couldn't just be beating the pavement with her. And usually I didn't have the energy to do that either. And I had to figure out, like, usually what I would do with these young women, I mean, I had talked to them over the phone or in person all the time, going through detail after detail. We'd talk before they had a study. I'd go over the study sometimes with them over the phone. This is what you say and how to do this, have them writing it down. Then they'd go do it. And then they'd call me. Then I'd do, oh, how'd it go? What'd you say?
Mm.
What'd she say?
Mm-hmm.
What'd you say? Oh,
Mm-hmm.
to me, it was torture.
Oh.
But they said it was helpful, and they really learned I was able, without going on campus, to raise up campus leaders,
Mm-hmm.
which is kind of unusual, might not work in every situation. But I tease the Dallas women. I only do that for a few months because I find it pretty torturous, until I feel like they know what they're doing and how to think. And
Right.
then I try to just do everything very relationally. But um, now I can't remember what I was going to say. Oh, I tease the women all the time that they should be grateful that I'm sick, or I'd be all in their business. And because I think I would. Early on in our training of people, Todd used to say, okay, the issue with me is that I just throw people out in the water and expect them to swim. That doesn't work. But you get in there and you swim with them and you never stop. And I think having health issues has made me stop swimming with people and actually helped me to be a better leader.
Yeah. There were a number of people it seemed like it was an epidemic in the ministry in the 80s and 90s with chronic illnesses, fibromyalgia, chronic
Mm-hmm.
fatigue syndrome, lupus. I know Erica Kim had lupus, and now she's healed of it, thank God. But you certainly weren't the only one. It's amazing what you've been able to do and be sick. One question that it leads me to, there are a number of people that used to be in the ministry that are no longer in the ministry, and there's some that have walked away or are just doing different things now spiritually, and for different reasons. Not only maybe bitterness, maybe anger, maybe they got fired, and it really affected them spiritually, and there became kind of like a double standard, almost like well, if I'm not going to get paid in the ministry, I'm not going to do well. Essentially, that's how it looked, that their identity in Christ got connected with their paycheck in the ministry. Any encouragement that you might give to those who've gone through rough times in the past, who've got their battle stories from the church pre 2003? You guys are super upbeat. You're loving. You're kind. You've come through it. You've certainly got your stories to tell, but there's a positivity. There's a hopefulness. There's a joy. Any advice you might give to those who don't feel that way?
So, thank you for asking that question. I think I want to be super sensitive on how I would answer that. Probably because everyone has their own story, and just to make a blanket statement or whitewash a wall, and it's not good. So I can share from our perspective why we're where we're at, the things we go through, our attitude, and not necessarily say, well, you need to do this too. I think one of the things that I remember, I love to read, I love to learn. I probably, since I was a teenager, would read. And the more I read about the Bible, the Old Testament, the New Testament, you see all the stories. It's like we live in chaos. This world is a hard world, and you just got to deal with that. I think in America, especially Texas, we live in a bubble, and we think, oh, you become a Christian, everything is going to be great.
Right.
That is so unbiblical.
Right.
Life's going to be rough, and whether or not it's going to come from the world or from the church or your family. I remember when I was out of the ministry, one of the lessons I learned is life's rough, life's hard. And when I worked out of the ministry for 2 years, I was physically fatigued. I wasn't emotionally fatigued, but man, I worked hard and I was tired. But when I was in the ministry, I was emotionally fatigued. So I tell everybody now, it's like, hey guys, you're going to do anything, you're going to be tired. You're going to go through hard times. Do you want to be physically tired or emotionally tired? And I think it's the same way with just hardship and trials. It's like things that make you get on your knees and pray to God are probably a good thing. And you got to have a big view of God, not a little view of God. You got to see that God's leading. And there's just too many stories in the Old Testament and the New Testament that don't quit, don't quit, don't quit. Keep pushing, keep looking at me. Let's walk on the water. Keep your sights on Jesus. And if you do that, things do change.
Yeah.
And I'm so grateful. I don't think, regrets. I look back and man, even the hard times, I don't regret. I hated them, but I don't regret them because I think they molded us. They taught us lessons. And I think now we can take some of those lessons and engage other people. And maybe they can learn from our suffering versus having to go through their own. And, like David, oh, I fought the lions and the bears. Oh, this guy Goliath is just like one of them. It's like, oh my gosh. See, that's good theology.
Right.
We're fighting the lions and the bears, and we're getting ready for the Goliaths.
Wow.
Well, what stinks is like, well, what happens when the Goliaths come? What's after them? It's like, oh my gosh. And the older we get, life's going to get harder.
Yeah.
So you just got to understand that. And you got to have God in your sights and not the world or your culture or your feelings.
Right. That's great. That's great input. Can you guys name a few people who've been influential in your life and why?
For me, usually it's been older women. And we moved around so much early on in ministry. I never had like one person that just kind of took me by the hand. But like Todd mentioned, I remember in Chicago the first time I was, I was so young and my children were young. Actually, the second time in Chicago, but and listening to Linda Brumley teach, and I have these little snippets. Like I remember her saying, "God's way always works," and that I've teased her about it. So she goes, "I said that really," but I have used that and thought of that so many times. As I'm trying to live life, okay, what is God's way? It's going to work if I'm doing it God's way. And I think of older, like here, Sally Hooper. I mean, she was ahead of me in life and just learning from her, imitating from her, different things she did and said. That was just off the top of my head. I'm sure there have been so many women who have helped me that I've learned from, but the ones that come to mind first are the older women. Some of them aren't that much older than me, but they're just ahead of me in life and maturity.
That's great.
Yeah. And I think, the people that I look back at our lives who are influential, that doesn't necessarily mean in a good way. They were just influential. But I think some of the positive ones, I got converted in the early days of Chicago. Marty Fuqua, he was like, hey, we want to start a church in Chicago, not one part of Chicago, in that whole church. And he had a kingdom view, a world view, hey, we're gonna take this, 10 million plus people, we're gonna take the gospel. And I just remember understanding that as a maybe a visitor, a young disciple, and just realizing that. And I think, Marty's faith of doing that in Chicago certainly inspired me. I'm very grateful for. I look back over the years, over the 40 years, there's different people that have done great things. I totally respect them. Here in Texas, Mike Tolliver and Mike's a great friend, great partner. Yeah, both of them are. And I love working with them. So they're definitely influential. But there's so many people. I hate to name names because
Sure.
you forget one and it's like, oh, I should have said their name.
Right.
But just very grateful for the influence so many people gave us.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Todd, one thing I've shared about you is you are definitely a kingdom connector. You're super connected with people. You're a people's person. I've shared about you in my classes that you've got the phone habit. I remember visiting you a few years ago to do a class, and you're on your phone a lot. You even shared that your ear gets sore from putting your phone to your ear. I'm sure you've got AirPods now to relieve the pressure, but
He gets a little bruise right here.
what's helped you? I mean, where'd that come from? And what's helped you to build relationships? And what advice would you give for those that maybe are not so much that way?
Yeah. Well, who knows? Maybe some of it's biological. It's definitely, we have great technology. Everybody's got a story. Everybody's gone through stuff. And good theology teaches that when God created Adam, it was very good. He looks at man as very good. And I love getting to know people. What's your story? Who are you? How did you get here? What's happened to make you who you are? And I think that's an aspect of loving man like God loves us. And so I think, my conviction is, I have a platform that I can love people, get to know people, engage people. I can find out their story and be curious about who they are. And that's fun. I mean, honestly, that's probably one of the reasons Patty and I are married, because our first date, it was just getting to know each other, getting curious and hearing our story. I remember when I first got baptized, back in the early days of Chicago, I didn't have kids, wasn't married. And I remember sitting there fellowshipping, and it wasn't like to go up to a brother and do the 3-pat on the back and half a hug and ask them how they're doing and then walk away after 3 minutes. I mean, we would sit down and talk literally like 20, 30 minutes. Sharon Ivy in Tennessee remembers those days. In the early days of Chicago, we would just sit there and you would fellowship. I mean, you got to know people and their background, their history, and it really bonded people. And I've just been doing that. And so, people are fun. We all have our idiosyncrasies. We're all broken. But when you can love somebody just for who they are and get to know their story, man, it's so fulfilling, so encouraging. And so, for me, it's like, I like doing it. I enjoy getting to know people and loving people.
Yeah. Patty, you feel the same way?
Yes. I mean, I feel a little more limited than Todd because I have to rest so much and all that because of my health. But yeah, I love it. I love hearing people's stories, getting to know them. You were talking earlier about some of the negative stuff, and it's kind of a funny story. Years ago, Todd and I were on a date, and the negative stuff, I don't really blame people because God's used it all in such amazing ways. We were on a date and we were talking about all the stupid, sinful things, poor choices, whatever that we've done since we became Christians, not even before.
Right.
And you'd think, why would you want to talk about that on a date? It was so encouraging because we were just felt so grateful. Look at what God is still doing, though. God's still
uses us. God has kept us faithful. And it's just amazing how God works, even through the good relationships, the bad relationship, everything.
Yeah, I'd add to this also what Patty just shared. Like, for instance, again, things that made a huge impact on our life when we got out of the ministry, and this is 10 years in the full-time ministry in the Midwest, plus in Chicago, the early days, becoming a disciple. So we get fired in Chicago. We moved to Dallas, and I am not exaggerating. During the 2 years we were here in Dallas, I received 3 telephone calls, and they were it was all business. Like, what about this? Why did this happen? Why'd you do this? Nothing, no calls. How are you? How's Patty? How are the boys? Are you guys doing okay financially? Nothing from anybody other than 3 business calls. And I remember the situation. I remember the opportunity just to start thinking about that and getting bitter, just angry about, I put 10 years of my life into the full-time ministry, and this is it. And I thought about it some, and I'm like, well, half of the problem is right here in Dallas. That's me. The other half is in the Midwest, and that's them. Well, at least I can start working on me.
Wow.
I can start working on how I love people, how I engage friendships. And so I would say, with that realization, I started making some big changes on how I built friendships,
Wow.
how I love people, how I engage people, how we as a couple, a family, engage other families. And I would say, almost a quarter of a century, it's been so encouraging and refreshing. We don't need any more friends.
But we want them.
We want more friends, but we have so many friends, real friends, deep friends, that God keeps blessing us building these relationships. But it's like, man, I had to evaluate, how do I treat people? How do I love people?
Yeah.
And I think that's something that we've really gone after. And I think that's honestly a big part of what's happened here in the Dallas church over the last 10, 15 years.
Yeah, we're going to get to that. It's very powerful. And I want to camp out on that a little bit, because especially with COVID, I mean, people are feeling isolated. People are feeling lonely. And, I think about my own phone. It doesn't ring a ton, and it's just, so let me go back over that again. So when you moved to Dallas after getting fired, you only, over the course of those 2 years that you were working, you only received 3 phone calls from disciples, and the content of those calls was business. And so no one called you from the Chicago or Midwest in the 10 years you'd spent there. No one called you for 2 years.
No, correct.
Oh my gosh. Now that would be tempting to feel bitter about that.
Now, Patty got some calls from sisters, and the women.
You know how sisters are.
Right.
They were being wonderful.
They're more in touch, but I didn't get any calls, and just business calls, and bitterness was starting to grow.
Right. Okay, that's very, very powerful. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the Texas churches, because they've been growing consistently since you moved there. There's been steady growth. The church, I think you told me it's 1,200, 1,300 disciples, and not only you, but you've got a strong partner there with Mike Tollifer in the South and in San Antonio. How do you explain it? Obviously, it's got to have some sort of connection there with what we just talked about being involved in people's lives.
Yeah, I think, boy, we could probably talk about this for hours and not have enough time. I think it's one, we had to get the Dallas church to a place. I mean, we moved here. The Dallas church was growing. I think it got up to about 1,400 members, and then it was just a free fall for like 7 years, and we got down to about 770. And I was like, guys, we need help. We need people to come in and evaluate us. And so we finally landed on that. We invited a number of people to come in, and not just the staff or the elders, but members of the church. Made some significant changes on how we led the church, and strategic decisions, and literally, we went on a 10-year run of growth. We plateaued about the last 2 years. What is it, 18 and 19? We plateaued. We didn't have any big drop offs. I think one year we grew by 3, and the other one we had a -8. And again, we realized we got to make some changes.
-8 people or -8%?
No, people. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. No, it was no big drop off. So it was like +3 one year, -8 the following year.
Mm-hmm.
So we had to make some more changes. And this last year, God, blessed the church. We grew by 8 or 5%.
Wow.
So we kind of pushed through that 1,200 mark, and we're like just getting close to 1,300 members. And so I think we had to deal with the Dallas church first. We had to address the relationships, how we lead strategically. What do we need to do with the kind of city that we live in? Because again, every person, every city is different, has different nuances, strengths, weaknesses. So we've been building on the strengths of the Dallas church and the city. But I think then you talk about Texas. A.T. Arneson used to be a wrestler in college, and he shared this story about how when you have someone who's really good, like a supreme athlete, a wrestler in one weight division, usually the wrestler right below them or right above them will become really good also. It's because, the coach had to have someone wrestle that great athlete. And, I think Mike Tolliver, who we love, we deeply, great relationships with both of them. He did this lesson from victory to victory and shared about just a lot of the victories that they'd been able to be a part of, which it's a phenomenal series. Well, our joke is that, well, we can do that lesson too, but it would be called from failure to failure. And I want to do that sometime, because I'll have him do his victory to victory, and we'll come back and, from failure to failure. And, we've just built a great friendship, and it wasn't based on authority or position of life. It was just like, Mike and I are about the same age, and our families are about the same age. And in fact, 2 of our boys were roommates in college, and we just built a friendship based on friendship, love. And, Mike and I would wrestle emotionally, spiritually. We'd have talks, we'd have hard talks. I'm sure there's things about me that Mike would love that doesn't agree with, and vice versa. But that's okay, because we love each other and we're willing to engage. We can have a fight, and then afterwards we go out for a beer, because the relationship is so important. And when you have, 2 out of the 4 largest churches in our family of churches just emotionally connected, it's going to influence everybody else. You got Doug Wins and a great staff in Houston, and Dave Hooper and a great staff in Austin. And you get the 4 of us now. We're close. We have great relationships between the 4 couples and our staffs. Our staffs get together. Our elderships are having monthly talks on Sunday mornings, and it's just to talk about stuff. And you see these relationships now. It's just not 2 people. It's now groups of people building these relationships. And so we're planting churches. We're changing out some of the leadership because of moving or getting out of the ministry, whatever it is. And so there's a camaraderie that we're able to love one another. And I think that's been established now for 12, 13 years. And so there's a high level of trust that it's what's best for the person, not for the church. If we do right by the individual, God's going to take care of the church. And so people know that, hey, I'm being loved for who I am, not because, hey, let's get a few more baptisms out of them. We're trying to build healthy. And so it's just been so encouraging consistently over the last 12, 13 years, just seeing how as a group of churches, we're bonding and growing. And it's not easy. It's hard. And sometimes we've got to have hard talks. And Sometimes we got to talk about things that are uncomfortable, but because you know the other person cares for you and wants you to be successful, it's easy to have those kind of talks. And that's why I go back to the early days of Chicago. That's kind of how I build Dallas and Texas. It's like, it was so heartsy. It was so, man, we get to do this for God. This is awesome. I remember the first time we talked about having a bring your neighbor day. I was like, we could bring our neighbors? Oh, cool. Let's do this. I had 4 friends come with me to church. And it was just so heartsy, so exciting that we can make a difference. And, that's what we're trying to do in Dallas and Texas.
Yeah.
I just want to say, Todd won't tell you this, but from my perspective, I see Todd as being excellent at building team. I mean, he's a strong leader, but he just makes all the guys feel like they're part of the team. Like, we've seen situations where there's almost an adversarial relationship between maybe the evangelists and the elders or something, because there's just kind of a lack of trust there. And Todd has worked so hard at his relationships that there is such a deep level of trust. Or before an elders meeting, he pretty much knows how everybody's feeling. He's had lunch with them, he's talked to them on the phone, whatever. So there aren't these intense emotional times where someone's just has saved up something and is just, dumping it on the group, and all this turmoil. We don't have that, because he gets in there and he works with these guys and they feel respected and part of the team. And he does that with the board, with the elders, the other staff guys, everything.
Yeah, it's very kind. I think, one of the philosophies that we have, it's what's right, not who's right. I don't have to be right. I don't care. I don't want to be the best. Play basketball. I don't want to be the best player. If I'm going to be the best player, that means we're going to have a really terrible team in whatever I do. But it's what's best, not who's best. And so when we try to move like the Dallas church or even Texas, it's like, okay, what's best, guys? What's best? What's going to glorify God? What's best on moving this ministry? It doesn't have to be my ideas. I don't care if they're my ideas. That's not that important. It's what's right. It's what's best. What's going to be the best for everybody to move the ministry. And when you have that kind of philosophy and everyone buys into it, then you don't have these, what I call prima donnas walking around thinking it's got to be their way or the highway. It's like, now, guys, we're a team. Let's build together.
Okay. So a couple questions about that. Texas has definitely been a bright spot. And I think people would point to it and go, well, you're there, Mike Tolliver there. That's a lot of talent. And you've got other strong leaders in the other larger cities. What have been some of the highlights besides the growth there in Dallas? What kind of planting has gone on over the past 10 or 15 years since 2003?
So
if you can just give us some highlights.
Yeah, well, it's not a planting. What I'll call this is, I call it the Campus Ministry Fund. So we have a family in the Dallas church that, they just wanted to invest. They wanted to invest in the future, to build God's kingdom in the future. And they were willing to drop in like $100,000, $200,000 a year. And, their only request was the other churches participate in this. That was it. You guys come up with a dream, what you want to do. And just as long as you get the other churches to cooperate, we'll give this money. So we call it the Texas Campus Ministry Fund. We're actually doing it in the Heartland also. And so you have the large churches working together with this family, dumping in altogether maybe $250,000 a year. And we're able to have campus ministries in cities that would never be able to afford those campus ministries because the churches are so small, like a College Station, for instance.
Right.
We wouldn't have a campus couple if it wasn't for this fund. Same thing in other places like Oklahoma City, OU. And so now, because we've established that unity amongst the big churches and this family, we're able to go after other places. Like, we're going to start something. We're going to the leader couple, Tony and Carmen Hill, are moving to the East Coast. And so we're sending a young couple in there. You got Baton Rouge, LSU, and again, the Baton Rouge church is working with Texas. Let's build God's kingdom. So you see this unity. So we plant churches like the Valley, Corpus Christi, other places like that. I think so there's a high level of let's work together. I think right now we're trying to make sure that we're taking care of some of the smaller churches. So we're kind of coming up with a game plan of, if you're under 100, let's get everybody to over 100.
Right. Okay.
And then we'll start going after some of these other places that we want to go for, like Beaumont, Tyler, other places.
Yeah, it's a big state, big geographically and populace wise. You're head of the church. What's the name of the committee? Church Growth and Health Committee. I'm sorry.
Mm-hmm.
Is that the right title? So you kind of head up a committee made up of disciples from Indonesia and Canada, who the goal of that group is to get other small churches growing. Can you talk a little bit about that? Like, what are you doing with that? What's the point of that?
Yeah, well, there's one committee, but there's actually two subcommittees.
Okay.
So the bigger group is called the Church Growth and Health Committee. Within that group, you have minister health and church growth. And so Darren Overstreet up in Seattle, great brother, great friend, working with the Northwest. He's been focusing on ministers' health, sending out videos, getting some experts in our fellowship, just because, Marty Fuqua used to say, healthy cows give milk. And if you have healthy ministers, healthy emotional ministers, guess what? They're gonna lead their people in a healthy way. And so we're trying to put together content that our fellowship of churches can listen to or watch, and just to help us help our ministers get healthy. The other committee is the church growth, and it's just talking about dynamics, strategies. I put a video out maybe a couple months ago. Harlem Salim just put a video out a couple weeks ago with all the work they've done in Indonesia, which is crazy awesome. It's just blow away. But again, they have healthy relationships, healthy leadership, which is creating a healthy membership. And so, we're going to be just putting out more content. I think the ILC in Orlando next year, we're going to really focus on both of those things, minister health and church growth. But again, healthy cows give milk. And so we're going to be able to grow when we're doing it God's way, focusing on glorifying God and building in a healthy way that's sustainable.
Okay, so let me ask you this. I mean, it's one, Todd. I know some of the people on that group. There's you lead a church of over 1,000. Harlem, he's leading a church of multiple thousands. Just it's huge. 2,000 plus. There's a whole country that he's heading up. I mean, miracles constantly. Andy Fleming used to lead a church where they baptize 800 a year. I mean, these guys are like kingdom celebrities in the eyes of many. But what, from your life and from your example, how can you scale that down? Let's say someone's listening, they're leading a Bible talk in Tokyo right now, or they're leading a mid-sized church or small-sized church in Spokane, Washington, or they're leading a small ministry in Oahu or something like that. And they're not, maybe they are in the professional ministry, or they're not, or they're leading a Bible talk, in Covina, California or something. I don't know. But what can they take from what you've learned to apply to their current situation? How can they get their church and their ministry growing right now? What 1, 2, 3 steps would you take, Todd and Patty?
Well, Paul talks to Timothy in 2 Timothy chapter 1 and 2. He talks about entrust to reliable men. I think there's one thing leading a Bible talk. There's another thing making that Bible talk 2 Bible talks or 4 Bible talks. And then, same thing with sectors and regions. The challenge you start with first is your walk with God, your love for people. God loves us. God loves people. Are we lovers of people? Are we lovers of God? Do we really celebrate people when we talk to them? Are we focused on our discussion with them, loving them, or are we scanning who we should go talk to next? When we're talking to them, people know if you're interested in them.
Okay, convicted right already. Okay, I got my hand raised. All right.
Yeah, we got our cell phones. We're looking at our cell phones as we talk to somebody. It's like, when there are people that I've met, when they look at you, you feel like they're just boring down into your skull because they're focused on what you're saying to them.
Right.
And I want to be like that.
Yeah.
I want people to know when I'm talking to them, I'm listening.
Yeah.
Now, I'd love to say I've done that all my life, but I haven't, but I'm trying to be. And so when I engage people, I want them to feel loved and believed in, that I care. And then you start working with reliable people. There's ways to work with reliable people. You give them responsibility, you walk with them, you build a relationship. So one of the things we haven't shared about, we've been here for 20 plus years, and we moved down to the South, and we were down the South for like 10 years. Oh my gosh, I love that group of people in the South region of the Dallas church, just family. Our kids grew up there. Well, the Dallas church was going through some hard times, and so it was decided that we needed to move back to the north. And so, we're still in the same church, and it was hard leaving a lot of our friends, but there was a huge need for the whole church for us to literally be at the epicenter of the great heartland. And so we moved to where it all the center of attention was for like 20 years before us. And so it was populated by a bunch of hurt, frustrated disciples who loved the kingdom, didn't leave the church, didn't move away, but they were just hurt. They felt unloved. And, we just came and like, we're going to love you. We're going to love this group of people. And we didn't quit. Our feelings were hurt. I'm sure we've hurt other people's feelings, but we're not going to quit loving you. We're going to love you because you're our friends. We're going to build great friendships. And I can share horror stories that we had. Patty could share horror stories. It took 2-3 years to win some people over because, again, they were hurt, but they loved the kingdom. They saw great things happen in the past, and they believed still. They still believed, but they were frustrated. And so we're like, hey, you know what? God still loves us. Great things are going to happen. Be patient, be faithful, do it God's way. And this group of people, I am not exaggerating, literally led the way for the next 10 years.
Wow.
It was a great group of people. And we all go through hard things. Even the people who might have led it in the past, they were going through things. But if we're focused on loving people, not the way I want to love them, but the way they need to be loved.
Right.
I mean, that's a clarification there. It's like, I might like to love my wife the way I want to love her, but that doesn't mean she's going to feel like I'm loving her.
Right.
So I got to figure out, okay, what makes Patty feel loved? And that's a part of my responsibility as a leader. I had to learn how to love these people. And I think so for these small churches, maybe really small churches or medium-sized churches, you gotta learn how to love them and inspire them to do greater things that Jesus did. I think about that. I was like, oh, I can never do greater things than Jesus did. But then, you're talking about all these kingdom connections and like on the world, Jesus never did that. He never had a Zoom call with Indonesia or Tucson, Arizona, or I'm like, oh my gosh, Jesus is right. We can do greater things. So I would say that's a big part.
So let me just kind of summarize. So you said, one, basically face down the problem. Go to where the problem is most severe. You went to a situation in Dallas where it was the epicenter of kind of the old heart of the church, and you faced it. You faced the problem. You didn't run away from the problem. You decided to really care about people and love them, and love them as they needed to be loved, not as you wanted to love them. And then finally, focusing on raising up reliable people, raising up young leaders. Okay, Patty?
Can I just add real quick
Sure.
before Patty says anything? And it's like now, 12, 13 years later, when we've established that, I think we have 7 elders. We're going to appoint more elders. We got, almost 30 members on staff. We have relationships throughout the church. The trust is so high. I think we've hit our special missions contribution, 12 years in a row. Our budget, we keep underspending and overgiving. Last year, we gave almost $325,000 to benevolence.
Wow.
And it's just people are reaching out, they're discipling, they're giving. It's just a great place to be because, when you put the work in, great things will happen, but you can't run away. You can't run away from a fight. But you got to fight fair.
Okay.
You got to fight God's way, not the world's way.
But one thing I think about in that situation, I go, okay, how do you do that? How do you face a challenging, because that's one of the most common questions people ask me is, how do you motivate mature and middle-aged Christians? What you just shared about is probably the biggest question to the small church leader, because there are a lot of small churches out there that have been out there for 20 or 30 years. They're filled with 30 or 35 disciples that have hung on. They're faithful, but they're hurt, they're angry, or they're not that motivated. They're not bringing people out to church. And how do you love people while at the same time having expectations to grow? I mean, my initial thought is like, okay, you can love people, but then are you still connected to the mission? Just loving just for loving's sake. People, they're happy just being together, but there's nothing gets done to advance the kingdom of God.
I think in the beginning, one of the things when we moved to this area is they needed to see us living it and not just telling people what to do or pontificating. I mean, we needed to be bringing our friends out, bringing neighbors, and, some of our neighbors got baptized, all that kind of stuff. I think that really, really helped. Because I think we did. That was a part of building that trust Todd keeps talking about.
That was huge. They saw we were actually doing what we were telling them to do.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Whether or not it was, reaching out, bringing visitors, our marriage, our kids, and that was huge. And so we set an example to this group, and they responded. I mean, that's really, in some ways, that's all they needed to see, saying, "Oh, okay, you're not just telling us what you learned, you're actually doing it, what you're telling us."
Right.
And so, I think, and again, I don't want to just sit there and think, oh, you just love people and that's it. Just all you got to do is love people. No, there's so much, like I said, we can be hours here.
Sure. Right.
But I remember a brother, he's still faithful, him and his wife, phenomenal couple. Jamie De Palma is here in the Dallas church. He was in the military, went back to college, and we were discipling them down in Arlington. And I remember he said this like 20 plus years ago. He said, Todd, when I get together with you, I'm encouraged, challenged, and a little ticked off. And I was like, oh my gosh, that is the nicest compliment anyone's ever given to me in the ministry. And I knew what he meant. He loves us. He loves me. He still loves me. I love his family. Got 2 awesome boys and a daughter. And I just, man, when you get together with people, you want to encourage. You want to challenge them.
Yeah.
But sometimes you need to poke the bear and tick people off a little bit.
Yeah.
But when they know it's in love, people respond.
Yeah. That's impressive. Well, thank you guys so much for your time. And again, we could just keep talking longer and longer. But any final advice for a person who wants to make a life where there's no regrets? You just die feeling like, hey, I put it all out there. And someone who really wants to make this life count.
Nope. Go ahead.
This almost sounds trite, but I think just always trying to do it God's way. And sometimes we fail at that. Sometimes we don't know what that looks like, all that. But I think the only thing we can really regret is when we just quit trying.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree with that. I think, I look back in the last 30 plus 35, whatever years it is in the ministry and as a disciple, I might regret looking back at maybe some of the stupid things I've said, maybe hurtful. And so I got to really guard my tongue. I think I've learned that as I've gotten older. I've done better, but I still need to watch that. I think I can't think of any regrets, honestly. I love what's happened. I love what God's doing in our lives. I want to give all my heart. Maybe the one thing I wish I would have done differently is learn a second language, like you, learning Japanese. And I really do regret that, not really pushing myself to learn a second language, because I think it's hurt my effectiveness maybe in places that we could have helped a little bit more. But I would say honestly, if you give your whole heart fully, you're not going to look back and have regrets, because I don't. Those things, it's like, amen. It's not that big of a deal. But before we're done, I do want to say thank you to you and Pam. We love and respect you guys so much, and what you're doing with the Churches Under 100 workshop and just how you're trying to build. You guys are gifted kingdom treasures, and it's such an honor just hearing your ideas and your thoughts. What a blessing that is. And we love you guys deeply.
Oh,
Absolutely.
thank you so much. That's really encouraging. And I appreciate your friendship. And I've learned so much from you guys. You guys have helped us, Pam and I, so much, especially over the last probably 5 or 6 years that we've really got to know you. I know Pam knew Patty from back in the days in Boston in the 80s, but it's been a blessing. Thank you so much. And thanks for coming on the program today. And I want to thank you today for listening to the Rob Skinner podcast. If you're enjoying this podcast, I'd like to ask you a favor. Please let your friends know about where it is, how to find it. Let your church friends know, your family, and please spread the word. Please pray for the work that we're sending out this summer to Flagstaff, Arizona, and we're also trying to get a church going, a replant in Hilo, Hawaii. My goal is to inspire you to make this life count, live a no regrets life, and multiply disciples, leaders, and churches. Have a great day, and make this life count.